Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Chaim Gottschalk in memory of his maternal grandmother, Shoshana Etzioni Rezel Bas Nachum, her neshama should have an aliyah. This episode is also sponsored by Mosaica Press. Check out their many titles, including the newly published Is Alternative Healing Kosher by Rabbi Yoshua Kaganoff. Rabbi Kaganoff's transformative sefer offers a penetrating analysis of halachic sources and their relevance to today's medical practices. This 448-page work examines the Torah's guidance on healing by drawing on the wisdom of the Rishonim, the Shulchan Aruch, and later Poskim, providing readers with a balanced, scholarly approach to alternative health treatments. By delving into this complex topic, the sefer addresses critical questions such as what are kosher medical treatments according to the Rishonim, the Shulchan Aruch, and the Poskim, what distinguishes facts from old wise tales, and what exactly is a segula, what is science in halachic context, is there such a thing as kosher science, and what role does Teva play, are spiritual treatments still applicable today, what level of corroboration is necessary to permit a specific treatment, and much more. Combining a rigorous research with practical guidance, this sefer is an essential resource for rabbis, educators, and Torah-observant individuals seeking to navigate modern health challenges and wisdom and clarity. Pick up a copy at your local Judaica store, or you can order from mosaicapress.com, where you can find a link in the show's notes, and use code CHATTER, that's CHATTER, for 15% off. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email svarmchatter@gmail.com or see the link and information in the show's notes below. You can also find a link in the show's notes to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Svarim, book deals, and more. And finally, if you could please rate and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen, 24/6, Apple, Spotify, and also subscribe to the podcast, of course. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Rachel Greenblatt, who is the Judaica librarian at Brandeis University and senior lecturer in Jewish studies at Dartmouth College. And we will be discussing Glikl, or otherwise known as Glikl of Hameln, Hamel, as she says, Glikl Bas Yehuda Leib, and her memoirs, which were written between 1691 and 1719, as it says in the title of the new edition published by Brandeis University Press. She lived about 1640s, 44, 45, 46, 47, somewhere thereabouts, till 1722. And this is a fascinating memoir, autobiography of a Jewish woman, businesswoman, very, very famous. So thank you, Dr. Greenblatt, for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's sort of tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
So I, as you can hear when I start talking, I grew up in the United States. I did my undergraduate education in the United States. I went and studied in Israel after that. And somehow, after another period in the United States, found myself back in Israel in graduate school at the Hebrew University, where I did my MA and PhD. I guess it's that I had done really American and European history, and then I learned at Pardes and at Matan in Jerusalem, and then when I sort of started looking to put it all together, I said maybe I should give this Jewish history thing a spin, and that's what I did. I went to Israel to learn more about the field, and gradually became more and more pulled in, and
Okay, and you did, I should mention, even though we are doing Glikl here, and this is something, but you did, your first book is on Prague, something that I do have a interest in, as I guess I've said in the podcast, or definitely those who know me know, and we do have to get to that in an episode on Prague. So your work was focused on Prague originally, right?
Right. So I got interested in early modern Jewish history, the 16th, 17th, 18th century. And I began looking for topics within that period. It's really a transition, right? Where some things are very medieval and traditional in Jewish life, and other things are, I wanted to see before Haskalah. I wanted to see what communities that contended with some of the challenges that early modernity brings, like the press, and transit and travel. I wanted to see how traditional communities contended with those things before the big revolutions that happened in the 18th century. So that's really what I got interested in and ended up focusing on within that. Yeah,
and it's titled To Tell Their Children, Jewish Communal Memory in Early Modern Prague, published by Stanford University Press. So stay tuned. We'll get to that, and let's jump to that podcast episode. Okay, so Glikl. Let's talk about Glikl. How did you become interested in Glikl?
So I was trying to think about this since we set up this podcast, and I think that I actually read Glikl at some in the old Lowenthal translation at some point independently. I did not take, I don't think, any Jewish history classes in my undergraduate degree, but I read Glikl and I read Cecil Roth's biography of Doña Gracia Mendez, right, the great Jewish woman of the 16th century also. And so I guess it kind of was stuck there in my head somewhere. She's such a fascinating woman. But when I was doing my doctorate at the Hebrew University, and as I was putting together a proposal and a committee, I decided to work on the way, as you said, the Jews of Prague, a traditional community, viewed their own past and the way they looked at their present as something worthy of historical consideration. In other words, I was looking at Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi Zachor, which I'm sure you've talked about in some context, right? Says that Jews are really focused on their biblical past or the messianic future. They don't really care about their own local history. It turns out I actually had the opportunity when I was in graduate school at the Hebrew University to present some of my work to Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, and that was quite amazing. And maybe there's not such a machloket, maybe we're sort of on different planes, but I thought about my work as I want to look at a single community and see what they really did think about their own past and how they really viewed history happening within their local community. And so that's why I ended up on Prague. Prague specifically, we can talk about when we get back here, so I'm right to another discussion. But I wanted to look at a small community because I wanted to look at all the different ways in which a community can think about its past, right? So it's gravestones, matevot. It's if there's rabbinic writing that turned out to be a little too big. But if they write not just chronicles, but the way the women in the objects they donate to the synagogue, the way that the cemetery, the way all these different things reflect what a community thinks about its past. So I'm putting together this committee, right? My advisor was Professor Richie Rachmel Cohen, and I had the good fortune that we added Yisrael Yuval, who's a medievalist, and then we need some people to fill it out and to really support me in this work. And my way of thinking at the time was, well, isn't it silly when we talk about Jewish cultural and social history, we're focused almost solely on Hebrew sources. I mean, there's people in Germany and Europe who do the archival sources in the local languages. But when we look at the Jewish point of view, we're focused on Hebrew sources. If somebody was trying to do German history, what we call general history, right? The history of Christian Germany in the 16th and 17th century, and they were using all Latin sources to understand the social and cultural history, we'd think they were nuts. Of course, you need the vernacular. And here we are, and we do Jewish cultural history and Jewish social history, and we use the Hebrew sources. That's their Latin, right? They learn it. It's important, but they're having their lives in Old Yiddish. Like, how can we look at that? We have to look at Old Yiddish. We have to look at all the sources we can find in Old Yiddish. And I'm already like at the point of proposing my dissertation, and I don't really know that language very well. But we put Chava Torniansky, who's the expert in Old Yiddish in the world. I have the good fortune to be at the Hebrew University, and there she is when she's on the committee. And my thought at the time was, well, this is really important, but we won't find very much. Like, that's just something to say. The Jews were mobile, they were attacked, and even before World War II, they moved all the time, and so the sacred texts were kept. We have the Hebrew, we just don't have the Yiddish stuff. Too bad. But then as I start doing the work, I found out I'm really wrong. We have much more than I thought. We have, thanks partly to Rabbi David Oppenheim in Prague, lots of Old Yiddish from Prague. I'm sure that more was lost than we have, but we have tons. And so here's Chava, who really takes me by the hand and really walks me through the manuscripts that I found from Prague, and who really helps me understand this language and the culture. And her main project, all the years I was there, is Glikl. Chava had done a PhD also at the Hebrew University, and she had already, when I met her in the late 90s, already for years been working on understanding this book. And so I really was sort of like a backseat view or outside the window, right? I could see her going through it. I saw chapters, and you just couldn't help but be drawn to all the work that Chava is putting into this book and to make a new translation into modern Hebrew and critical edition. I mean, people would say she told at her retirement party, the book still wasn't out, and she tells the story, people would see me in the halls and they stopped saying Mashlamech Chava, and they would start saying Mashlam Glikl. Like, she became so identified with the project. And so that's really how I became, just in general, it wasn't in Prague, but it was in the early modern period, and I was teaching this period, and everybody uses it. And I had this amazing view on the side of this wonderful work that was going on that Chava was doing.
And Glikl really is a fascinating book, memoir, autobiography. For those that aren't familiar, we're going to talk a little bit about it. I will say right at the beginning here, we're not going to do it justice in this podcast, I'm sure, and everybody should read it. It's just a fascinating look in the period. Whether it will be written by a man or a woman, it's written by a woman, which is extremely unique, and I think it's just a really great read. I want to say that just in the beginning, just before we even start.
I should have said that right to the beginning, right? This is a woman who had 14 children, 12 of whom lived to adulthood. She the whole time was running a business. It's very clear throughout the book. She's running the business with her husband, right? They're running this business. They're running their household. They're raising their children. They're marrying their children. They're creating networks all throughout Central Europe with other Jewish families and dealing with other things. She's just, I mean, the ultimate definition of leaning in. She's just a powerhouse, and also an artistic and important writer.
Now, one more general question before we start talking about Glikl. How rare is it to have an autobiography / memoir from a woman at the time, whether it's Jewish or not? I mean, you can talk about how is it more rare that she was a Jewish woman or not, but how rare is it to have something like this, a complete, basically autobiography of her life?
It's pretty rare. Right. So I'm actually working on this question right now, how historians ask, can we even, historians of this period love to go to Glikl. There's a million details about daily life, about business, about travel, about what people ate, about how they managed holidays when they were traveling, all kinds of questions. And then they say, oh, but this is a unique woman. How can we even rely on this one source? And I really think that, yes, she is certainly unique. Of Jewish autobiographies, what do we have? We have, and I try to collect these. There's Leon de Modena from the previous century, who had an autobiography in Hebrew. After Glikl, there's Yaakov Emden, but there's not really like full-length things like this. The question whether it is autobiography and what autobiography is a huge sort of academic scholastic question. But I'm much more interested, and I worked in my own work on what I call not just me, all European historians, autobiographical writing. Right? Where can we find different places where people, women or men, write a little bit about their own lives? So in this period, it's very common for Rabbanim who write books, right? All kind of Sfarim have an introduction that has some sort of autobiography. It's usually in the genesis of the book, right? They're telling how they came to the book, or the book is named for them or for a family member, and so they're telling how it got the name, and so they tell something about themselves. So I kind of want to put it in that context, and also because we're not sure how to define Glikl as a genre. When it gets defined as autobiography is when, and we may talk about this in the next, if we get to talk about the translation. When it gets defined as autobiography is when editors and translators start taking liberties and sort of cutting things out and trying to make a straight autobiographical line. And what Glikl writes is a mixture of the story of her life, of her relationship with her husband a little bit. She still has a high degree of privacy around that. It's not like a modern tell-all, about her business practices. And in between there are all these stories. And some of them are like drashot that she could have heard in the synagogue. And some of them are just like Baba-Mises, and some of them seem to be Yiddish translations of something that comes from nowhere. And we don't know why in the middle of all this she's telling these stories. But what Chava's translation into modern Hebrew, that this translation that we're talking about by Sarah Friedman into English is based on, is it puts all that back for us. It puts it back in a single edition in beautiful, clear, 21st century, fluent, elegant English for us to be able to hear Glikl's own voice, which has really been lost over the century. And funny, the first edition came out in the 1890s, right? So in the century plus that we've had this in public view. So that's and that's a little bit of a question. So how rare is it? So we have nothing else like this. At the same time, it's very important to me, and I'm really working on this. I'm working on an article on this right now to emphasize that she's not the only woman who wrote, right? So she's only the woman who wrote like something like this. It may be that wills weren't just disposition of property, but ethical wills were sort of mixed in with the disposition of property. She even mentions other women's wills. There are many other women. There's Bela Perlhefter, who Elisha Karbach wrote about, and then I wrote a little bit, who corresponded with a Christian Hebraist in Hebrew that looks like Maskilic Hebrew. It's from the 17th century, but it looks like Maskilic Hebrew. So Glikl, yes, is special, but she mentions hundreds of business women, according by Chava Tornansky's count, and she does mention other women who wrote. So there is a context there that's yet to be explored, I would say.
Okay, and as you mentioned, there's this question of what an autobiography is, and we're not going to get into that kind of like as a more academic question here, but I mentioned autobiography, just that people should understand it's autobiographical.
For sure.
But as you pointed out, and I think we're gonna get into Glikl's life, but I'll just mention here already, she has 7 books, quote unquote, as she calls them, let's say parts of the book, let's say sections, but she calls them books. The first book is all Musar, ethical teachings. It's not autobiographical at all. And then throughout the book, it's peppered with these kind of mishalim, lore, myths, parables. Some are Jewish, non-Jewish, Yiddish. It's like in middle, she'll just go off. And sometimes, when I reread it for the podcast, what I did was every time I got to one of those, I just skipped it because you can read it while it's there, and it's great. I'm just saying for someone. First of all, it's a wonderful read in Sarah Friedman's English, and so you can just skip those because those are they're. So I read some of them, and some of them are like, wow, these are really old-fashioned kind of tales, but you can kind of skip them, and that's really interesting. So let's walk back. Let's talk about Glikl. As I mentioned, she's born in the 1640s, dies in 1720. She is German. She lives her life, and now I'll let you talk about Altona Hamburg once, but I'll let you talk about all of that and her basic biography. Of course, the book, again, is full of biographical details, but just her basic, biography, I'll let you talk about.
Okay, so Glikl was born, Papatroniowski says 1645. The date she mentions is a little different. Dates were not necessarily well kept, and especially a girl doesn't need a bar mitzvah, right? So they may not have the exact date. In Hamburg, and Hamburg is really interesting. So she's born in Hamburg and ends up spending most of her life in Hamburg. Ends up having a second marriage much later on in Metz and dies there around 1724. I just looked it up again. Hamburg is a city in Germany near the Danish border, and that's important. It's a port city, and early on in the 1600s, it probably had around 60,000 people. And there's a complicated history there where the first Jews to settle in Hamburg are Sephardim. They're Anusim, people who had been living as Christians in Portugal, come to try to revert to Judaism, and there was a small community in Hamburg. And after they're established there in the late 16th, early 17th century, and the early 1600s, gradually Ashkenazi families start to come also. But there's no citizenship, right? So in a historical point of view, Jews as a group have to usually negotiate rights with some sort of sovereign or leader to have the right to be in a place. And in Hamburg, the Sephardim had that, but the Ashkenazim did not have that when Glikl was growing up. And in 1648, that caused all of the Ashkenazi families actually to be expelled from Hamburg. So where do they go? There's a much older Ashkenazi community in Altona, which Glikl says is about a 15-minute walk away. But Hamburg's a walled city. It's a protected city. It's a fun thing. I looked on Google Maps this morning, and it tells me when you put in Hamburg and put in Altona, it tells me it's an hour walk. I don't know exactly what's where, but it's a walkable distance that people would daven in the morning, go into Hamburg, and come back at night on foot, right? So it's not a huge distance, but it's actually, Hamburg is its own free city, and Altona is in Denmark. And then there's another much smaller Jewish community in Wandsbek, which is also near Hamburg, that gets established a little bit later on. So Hamburg, let's go in order. Altona, Hamburg, and Wandsbek are called the Ahu communities for a variety of reasons. And this is quite unusual from what we know of Jewish history. Instead of having a single Jewish governing body, they have a joint from 1671. So at that point, Glikl's already 30, almost 30. They have a single joint community called Ahu for Altona, Hamburg, Wandsbek, right, with above. So that's the kind of unique thing. And it's really unique in that Hamburg's also its own city, and Altona and Wandsbek are in Denmark. By the time, so Glikl is actually engaged at age 12. It's the most heartbreaking and amazing thing when you read the beginning of her book with all the Musar. It also starts with her grief for her husband, right? And she says she started this book to get up because she would wake up at night in deep grief and she couldn't do anything, so she would just start to write. It's clear that it becomes something else, but it starts in her own telling as this sort of self-therapy, and she's in this deep grief for her marriage of 30 years. How old is Glikl grieving her marriage of 30 years? She's like 43, 44, right? It's just like mind-blowing. It wouldn't, we don't think it's right today, and we wouldn't consider it legal today, but this is what she had. She's engaged at 12 years old, and at 14 years old, she gets married to this person, Chaim, and she gets taken to live with his family in Hamel, in this little hamlet of Hamel, and just left there, right, for 2 years. And she talks about, maybe they're 1 year, 1 to 2 years that they're there. She talks about how hard that is. Eventually, they come back after a year or two. Chaim, maybe it's 1 year. Chaim and Glikl come back to Hamburg and live with her parents for 1 year. and establish themselves in business. And they go on to have, again, 14 children, of whom 12 live to adulthood. And this is the climax to which the book builds in book 5 of the 7 books or chapters, whatever you want to call them. And she's foreshadowing it all the way through the book. Chaim has an accident. He's never been very well, and he passes away in a sort of sudden way, leaving her with 2 married children. I guess that leaves 10, right? 14 minus 2 minus 2. Unmarried children, of whom the smallest are toddlers. And she then works. The goal of a person, this kind of matriarch and patriarch in this society, of this Ashkenazi, relatively well-to-do society of Ashkenaz at the time, is to marry off your children, right? That's not just a romantic need. It's not just a build a family, by Neman B'Yisrael need. It's a financial need. The whole financial underpinning of the family is based on these relationships and is setting people up in business in different cities. That's how this part of the level of the society works. So they really need to do that. So she does that. She succeeds in marrying off her children, and that's books 1 through 5. And then books 6 and 7 have to do with a second marriage that she says she's not going to get married again, and in the end she does. And that's a whole other sort of semi-tragic story at the end. I don't know if that gives you the basics that you're looking for.
Yeah, I think that is, and she talks a little bit in the beginning about her family, her father. There's a really nice story there about the stepsister with the French. I think that it's a really nice story. Yeah, actually.
So what is the book for? I mean, we talked about, is it an autobiography? What is the book for? I've come to think that the book is especially for the younger children who didn't really know their father, right? That's sort of what my opinion of the moment. I've read it many times, and I talk about it with many students. And so in the beginning, she gives the Musar for the first book, which is quite short. And then in the second book, she begins to tell different things, including the whole background. She wants to give, when she backs up to be systematic about it and to tell when she was born, and then backs up to her own family and her husband's family. Her father had a previous wife with whom he had no children. But the previous wife, who had passed away, had brought a daughter. So it's her father's stepdaughter. And she tells this story about her father's stepdaughter, who died before she was born. Right after the story happens, or not long after the story happens, she died in childbirth. But she tells how valuable it was. And really, this is great historic insight, too. So the grandfather, the father, I'm sorry, had a pawn shop. Some soldiers came in and left an item for which he gives them some money, right? And a few days later, they come back to retrieve the item. And they're speaking amongst each other in French. They're French soldiers, and the family is someplace in German lands. They're speaking each other in France, and they're planning that when this innocent shop comes back with the pawn, they're not going to give him money. They're going to take their jewel or whatever it was. They're going to take their jewelry back and the money, and they're going to run out of there. Nobody's ever going to catch them because they're from out of town. And the stepdaughter hears the story. She understands French, and when let me see if I can get the exact quote. She hears, well, the English doesn't quite capture it. She hears the story. Her father goes upstairs to get the pledge, and she screams out these lines, which are apparently from some kind of Hebrew song: "Beware, not the pledge, today here, tomorrow gone." She doesn't know what to say. She can't speak Yiddish, right? She tips her father off in Yiddish. That's close enough to German they're going to understand. So she takes this line from a song and she tips him off. And then he starts saying, like, he's used to dealing handshake of himself. Then he says, where's the money first? First, give me the money, then I'll give you the pledge. And they end up having a fight and leaving. And one of them comes back the next day and retrieves it, gives the money first and gets the pledge. And the stepdaughter, by her knowledge of French, saves this little piece of business. So it's great in terms of the theme that I talk about in my book, the wisdom of women, which runs under some things, but it also shows about the education of the sort of what we would call upper middle class Jews in Germany at this time, that it doesn't seem to be surprising. The French soldiers are surprised, but girls, and we see this from other sources, in well-to-do families sometimes learn French and drawing and music and other things that well-to-do German girls learned.
Yeah, and I think that when he comes back to redeem the pledge, he says,
Yeah.
"Useful for you. You invested wisely when you had your daughter learn French." So that was, and then it continues very sad. Glikl says how the father really cared for her, and he made a good match for her, as you said. That there's a constant theme throughout the book. This is what was going on in Germany. You're always making matches, money, dowries, marrying off. Glikl is preoccupied with this the entire book, but unfortunately, she died, and this is actually very you see another thing comes out, but she died. May she rest in peace during her first childbirth. And a few days later, her corpse was stripped of its shrouds. She appeared in a dream and revealed this. So they dug her up out of her grave and found it to be true. And then she says, the woman was sewing, the maid came in, and then the maid came in and says, the dead one is sitting here with you. I'm now going to paraphrase it. And they said they couldn't see anything. They gave the shrouds, and then she left. There's there's all sorts of different things mixed in, and you really get, also when you read it, you can almost envision the setting of what's going on when she's writing. And then she continues.
Sorry.
No, and then she continues on, and then she starts talking about the Tachvatat, when everyone, post Tachvatat, everyone's running away. She kind of gives you, after ran away from Vilna, you get a lot of different. I think it's post Tachvatat, actually. I'm not sure when it would be.
It's another attack a few years later. And actually, in Adam Teller's book, he talks about Tachvatat not being just those 2 years, but a continuation into the 1650s of all kinds of violence. Yeah, it is. It's this woman who learned French and was able to save the pledge, right, by speaking out in some kind of Hebrew, right? So there's something else about her education. And then she appears as a ghost, right? They bury her. She dies in childbirth. She appears and they bury her. But as the women are sitting around sewing, she appears among them, right, as a ghost, tells them she has no shroud, that it was taken, and then they fix it, and she goes away. So it's all, we think of these as sort of different things, this great, modern education and languages, and the other hand, the ghost story, but they're very much of one piece. And the concern, right, that the concern that Glikl, when she says that, is saying how righteous her father is because it's not his daughter. And he therefore, once his wife passed away, doesn't really have in her mind a responsibility to her. But as a man, she feels that he does have a responsibility. And the marriages are extremely important. And why do the wealthier families marry their children so young, right? Why is Glikl married at 14 and sent away? Because there's no FDIC, right? Their entire capital on which they're going to build their comfortable lives is on whatever they have in hand. There's no bank, and if there's no protection, there's no insurance. If the jewels are lost, and this comes up in another story early on in some raid or a war, then it's gone. It's just gone. So if you have wealth and you have this extreme insecurity about the wealth, and marrying a daughter costs money, why is it a dowry? Because the two families put money into the dowry. It's not just the bride and it's not just the groom, because that is the pot from which that couple will make their livelihood, right? So in America, I tell my American college students, this is a big difference from Israel, for instance. American college students expect of upper middle class, right? Not all college students by any sense, but upper middle class American high school students expect that their parents will pay for their college, and they expect that then when they get married, establish a household, they'll be on their own. Israeli upper middle class students expect that their parents will put money in their first apartment, right? They don't have to pay for college, but that's so we have different cultural assumptions, but both are ways that the parents help the children establish themselves and contribute to the next generation. So in Glikl's society, it's that match, it's that shidduch, and then the money, the dowry that goes into establishing oneself in business. There's other financial economic classes in the Jewish world in Europe at that time that Glikl's not talking about, right? There's a whole servant class, there's a whole poor class, right? There's other people, but in her socioeconomic class, that's how it works. So if you have the money today, then today you marry your daughter because you might not have it tomorrow, right? Like there's no, that's the reason. And for that reason, poorer Jews tended to marry their children later because they needed to collect the money. They would work as a servant for a few years and they would collect it, and they would be married more like 18, 19, and wealthier Jews would marry them younger. I'm diverging from your...
No, it's good. And I want to mention something else also earlier about the father that she says, which is like a cute thing. She said, she talks about a little bit, not so much about her parents, but a little bit. She said they settled in Hamburg, and she said her father did business in precious stones and other things, the way a Jew does. A little bit of that, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So I like that quote as well. So, and then her father serves as a parnas, which we can get into. Parnas is very important. I've discussed this in other podcasts that I've done in the past. In Germany, it's a very powerful position. The importance of the community, self-governing the Jewish communities, paying taxes, etc. I think when I had Professor Deborah Kaplan, others, I'm sure this came up a number of times in the podcast. So let's talk about Chaim Hameln, her husband, or Hamelin, and Reb Chaim, I think she refers to him throughout the book. And he is really other than herself, one of the main figures. One, like you said, the whole book starts out because of her grief for him when he dies tragically when in his 40s.
Yeah. Yeah. She just, so that second book talks about his family, and the family that he comes from and his parents and his older siblings. He's one of the younger children in his family. Uh, his father was his family was just, according to her, in one place, I saw that again today, two Jewish families in Hamel in this little, and that's a big culture shock when Glikl moves there. And so she talks though about her father-in-law's, about him waking very early to pray, about his righteousness, about his learning, about wonderful people they are. And you think about it, a 14-year-old, right? She's married, but she's a 14-year-old kid who gets sent to live with this family, and they really become her surrogate family. And she feels very strongly about that. And then you see these relationships continue, right? So she introduces them in that second book. His oldest sibling, I think he's called Moshe, gets killed actually in a very unfortunate instant when he's sending off to be something to do with his shidduch. He's sent with two servants, and the three of them get shot. I'll hold that other thought. The three of them are shot, and they brought to the barber surgeon, the person in the town that can help them, and he's sure that the two Moshes, Moshe the bridegroom to be, and Moshe one of their servants, seem like they haven't got a chance. They're with this other person, Yaakov, and Yaakov, they say Yaakov is not gonna make it. The other two will be okay. A few days later, the opposite happens. That the oldest brother, right, Chaim's oldest brother, passes away. Glikl talks about him. She writes about him as if she knew him, but she clearly didn't know him. Right? She comes only when her husband is old enough to marry, and this oldest brother would have been married first, and he was, long since killed in this tragedy. And then this Yaakov, they call him shot at Yaakov because I didn't look up the Yiddish. I'm sorry, because he was shot at and yet he lived. He also, it's interesting because I've read this many times, and as a modern reader, you think that it's missing I mean, she talks about the grief for her husband. That emotion is there, and the grief when her children are sick, or her children too, her children pass away. Her grief is there, but sometimes the other emotions are flat compared to what we expect in sort of a modern tell-all memoir. And I just noticed today this shot at Yaakov shows up later, and he's drunk all the time, right? And then we can tell I don't know if you want to get into that story later, but only today, after looking at this thing, if I first read it even before graduate school, it's decades ago, I don't want to say, right? And it's just today it occurs to me, well, he had this trauma, right? Yeah, this is trauma of being on this trip with these two people who were shot and they died, and he lived, and we don't know, survivor's guilt, what he has, but later he becomes this person who can't stay away from liquor for the life of him. He's clearly addicted in the later story, and I never put it together today with this trauma that he had earlier. So yeah, I don't know.
That's a very good point. You sympathize with him, you don't know what it was like, but yeah, there's a story with Glikl. We'll get into that. But Shadi Yaakov is drunk and leaves her. Should mention earlier also where she talks about the Swedish war with Denmark, and she says, I cannot write much news about it since I was a child and I had to sit in a cheder, which is really interesting. So she had some sort of education. We don't know exactly what she's referring to. I think that's on page 61 in the new translation. And so I'll just give page numbers once I'm reading it for anyone.
Yeah. So people have obviously tried to turn the sentence upside down in all which ways. It's translated here that he gave his children boys and girls alike. So Glikl's now talking about her father. Gave his children boys and girls alike in education in the higher matters as well as practical things. I think that's like I'll have to look later and see if I can find the original. It's it's something about Aretz and Shemayim, if I recall correctly, but I'm not sure that I do. It's really, we really don't know, and she also uses the word cheder. It may be like inye de mala, minye de mata. It's some phrase like that. I can't remember exactly. We don't know what cheder is exactly, like later cheder, but it doesn't mean that every single community, right? So she mentions it. There's a lot of phrases here. He gave his children boys and girls alike in education. So it seems to me, sort of like trying to parse apart little words, that she has to tell us that her father educated boys and girls, both in things like French, right, that we already heard, and reading and writing and arithmetic and the things. We can see later she writes contracts, right? She clearly has a foundational secular education in addition to a foundational Jewish education. And she tells us in this one sentence that her father did this. This wasn't like some kind of autodidact. Her father did this for all his children, boys and girls. And yet, because she has to say girls, we can't go around claiming that all girls in this place, all Jewish girls, were getting this education, because so then she might not have had to tell us that her father did it for his daughters, right? So, and this comes up later in terms of the business and how much was it unusual that Chaim and Glikl were such equal partners in their business? How much can we learn from that? And one way I talk about it is plausibility, right? So we can't see from this that every girl got this education, but she doesn't see it unusual enough for everybody around to sort of go berserk and think, oh, this couldn't be. There's a plausibility to it that some girls did get this. That's what right? That it's not necessarily everyone. We don't know what percentage, and they need it, right? They need it. They need it for their livelihood. It's really important to Chaim that Glikl can do the books.
Yeah, and so there's that as well. And we'll jump, kind of bounce around here, because I find I've done some of these, Michael Toiv the Chida, some other ones. It's hard. You really have to read the book to get the full scope, the whole story. So we're just pulling little things out and trying to highlight it. Some of it for those that aren't familiar, and just really to highlight why you should read the book, essentially. So there's also a really kind of vivid description of Shabtai Tzvi. I mean, she's there in Ahu, and Hamburg is one of the places with the Sfardim where, Shabtai Tzvi is really, I think, Rex Sportis is there then, and he goes to Amsterdam. So this is really like one of the main places, and she really gives an entire description, and obviously woe to us that we fell for this. Here she talks about, there's a lot here, but she says that Ashkenazim also went to Sephardic synagogue. They'd bring letters in. Every time the young Portuguese men would don their best clothes with a wide sash of green silk, the costume of Shabtai Tzvi. So they were dancing like the rejoicing of the Beis HaShe'eva, read the letters, and then she said the father-in-law left everything and went to Hildesheim. He sent food he sent barrels with different things, linen and dried, and all packed, suitcases all packed to go. We know there's some other places, and it's got dried meats and things ready to go, and go up to the Holy Land, go to Eretz Yisrael. And she says those barrels stood at my house for over a year. Finally, fearing that the meat and other perishables would spoil, they wrote telling us to open the barrels and take out the foodstuffs, that the linen would not be ruined. They said the barrels stood like this for 3 years and more, for he believed he'd be needing them for his journey. This is not the desire of God Almighty. Hashem didn't want this. So she really, and then she continues, and we hope and pray. She's davening for Mashiach. She talks about Mashiach. She talks about redemption. It's a really point. You can see what really was going on. And then that talks about her daughter Mati, I guess, which is the one. I think the one that ends up passing away. But that's the one I think that has the story with the bubo and the suspected plague, which is one of the really. The real story.
That's Sipor. Yeah, Sipor has that story. So both those are two different things. So the Shabtai Tzvi part is fascinating, and it's fascinating because these crates are packed to go, and then after a year get the food out, so the linens don't get ruined by the rotting food, but it seems like the food's already gone, right? Like they're already not eating the food. They already lost that. This is spectacular in terms of Glikl as a historical source, because we don't have very many pictures of the Ashkenazi community being in the spirit of Shabtai Tzvi. And Elisha Karbach actually has written about this in a little article, in a pamphlet, in a lecture. I don't think it's, maybe it's in the Chagi's book. I can't remember, because the Ashkenazi establishment had a huge interest after the moment passed in deleting the record. Right? That this was very, very embarrassing for the Jews vis-a-vis the Christians, that they believed in this Mashiach who was going to come but didn't come, because it has echoes of the Jesus story and the Jews not accepting the Messiah. Right? So it's extremely embarrassing. And once the moment was passed, the Ashkenazi establishment really tried to obliterate any record of Ashkenazim who the whole communities were caught up. Whole communities believed in Shabtai Tzvi and that he was coming and that this was Mashiach and they were going to Israel. And yet that the record was purposely erased afterwards, so that this survives. And it tells us, it's partly because they were with the Sfardim, and the Sfardim are getting, right, because Hamburg, like Amsterdam, is one of very few places where these two communities are living together. And because this is happening in the Middle East, in Israel and Turkey, the Sfardim that are connected there are getting the letters faster, and they have the information, and they're dressing up fancy and so forth. And so partly the Ashkenazim in Hamburg are so caught up of it because of their close relationship to the Sfardim. And relatively speaking, right? They're not close, but they live close proximity to the Sephardim in Hamburg. But also her father-in-law, who doesn't have that proximity to the Portuguese Jews, he's also caught up in it. He's packing to go, right? Like he's packing to go. He sells everything and he puts it in these crates and he's ready to leave. So this really preserves a remnant of that we don't have a good window into a lot of other places. And it also is interesting when she talks about that moment passing, Glikl doesn't talk about Shabtai Tzvi betrayed us. If she knew about a conversion to Islam, she doesn't reveal it here. What she knew and didn't know, I don't know. All she says is for our many sins, for our many sins, for our many sins. We weren't righteous. And Chavaturniansky has a real this phrase, right? The Rosh Tevot for Bavanatenu Rabim appears all over the place. And Chavaturniansky, in contradictions to some other historians, really thinks that in many places this is kind of formulaic. Chava doesn't think that it's like you just say something bad happened and you use this phrase, right? Because like the same way saying Yetz Hashem, like without even thinking about it, it's just something that you say because she doesn't think that even though Glikl throws this, and therefore it's not in the English in all the places, even though Glikl throws this around constantly, she doesn't really think every single thing that goes bad is because she sinned. But when it comes to Shabtai Tzvi, she says it in plain words again and again in that paragraph, right? If we had really been righteous, then we would have been saved. And it's our fault. Like not in a single place does she blame the Sultan or Shabtai Tzvi. She just keeps saying if the moment wasn't right because we weren't righteous, and when we're righteous, it'll come. So that's interesting to me. That was something else that I saw in rereading this time. So I got to thank you for that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting passage, and listeners of this podcast familiar with the Shabtai Tzvi series, Shabtai Tzvi. So this is an interesting source to get information about Shabtai Tzvi. And like I said, then they talk about Mati, which is really, besides the story, this is an intimate picture of plague and what community plague breaks out, and really it's Glikl runs away with the family. They run away, and then the daughter is suspected. Glikl knows it's not, but the daughter is suspected of having plague, and then they run away. It's on Yom Tif, and you can relate the story. It's
also interesting, yeah. So they leave. They run away from Hamburg because of plague, and they go through Hanover where they have family. They're headed, I think, to Hamel where her father-in-law is at this point. The chronology, right, is a little. She also doesn't get the chronology 100%. And very innocently, she tells the story about I was like, because they don't have a full rights. There's all kinds of different levels, and it sounds like you talked to Deborah Kaplan and others. There's different levels of rights of settling in a town, and sometimes the Jews are tolerated. They don't really have a full right, so they all daven in houses. They don't have a right to a public synagogue. And they're in this house, and it has all the people davening, and Glikl's in another part of the house with the daughter. And the daughter says, I've got this pain under my arm. It really hurts. And Glikl knows that when she was in Hamburg, something like this happened, and the doctor sent some kind of like paste or ointment, and it made it all better. So without thinking about it, she sends the servant over. The servant has to go sort of like through the women into the men's side to ask Chaim to like arrange to send. I'm not sure why she needs one of the men to send. She's like wants to find out who the doctor is in this town to send for this ointment. In the meantime, the sisters-in-law and another woman from Poland. I mean, you could do a whole study on the view of Poland and Polish Jews in this book. Says no. Now they're scared, right? Because it's so interesting. We know this so much better now after COVID than we understood it before. People just go nuts, right? Like now we understand that you get a pandemic and every single thing becomes suspect, and every person who comes from another place becomes suspect, and everybody's nerves are just high and jittery. And so all the women hear the servant going through to the men, what's up? Oh, she has this thing. We need to get an ointment. And they go, no, it's plague. And they decide that the woman from Poland, right, because the woman's knowledge apparently, like the men's knowledge, is like higher in Poland or something. And they send for her, and she comes and looks at Sipor, the oldest daughter, and she says, plague, run away, everybody run away. It's not just an ordinary sore, it's plague, run away. And so then everybody goes nuts and they know what to do. Now we're in huge danger. We know the feeling, we who have been through COVID now, we know the feeling of fear or not fear, vaccination, not vaccination, and the sort of like way people get turned on each other in this situation, and the just generally high nerves that are going on. But they have an additional fear. The Jews in Hanover have an additional fear. And that is that if the governing body finds out, right, if the people, the Goyim and the leaders find out that the Jews are here with the plague, then all Jewish communities in danger, right? And we know that this is a long time motif of the Jews bring disease, right? Like this is a long time anti-Semitic motif. And when you combine that with the real danger of a pandemic, then you get this extreme fear. And we know it happened to Chinese people in the United States, right? Oh my God, they're bringing the plague. So so now you get this real fear, and they have no choice. They come up with a compromise situation. It's the middle of Yom Tov. They come up with a compromise situation. They send the girl with a couple other people, with the older Jews. Apparently, the older Jews from Poland like get kicked out of shul and sent to with a girl, a non-Jewish servant, and they take all this money. They have a whole conference with the Rav and the High, like, can they use the money? Yes, they can use the money because the whole community is in danger, right? So they take the money, they go like a mile away, they give it to some peasants, they stay in the house for a few days, and it's a whole like moving story about bringing them Yontif food. They say, here, we'll give you food for money for lodging. We know that our family is going to send us food for Yontif, because the Goyim are afraid of them too. When they show up in this other like place a mile away, they say, we know it's your holiday, and we know you stay with your own on your holiday. What are you doing over here? Right, so they basically have to bribe them, not just pay lodging. They basically have to bribe them to shut up and promise them that their Jews are going to bring them food. And they do that, and there's a whole like poignant scene where Chaim goes with the people who are bringing the food to the little girl, and the girl sees him, and at first she wasn't scared. She's just like going out to play in the woods. But then, she sees him and he sees her, and they're both screaming, and they both have to be held back from embracing each other. But thankfully, within a few days, it passes. The whole time, Glikl saying, what are you talking about plague? If the store was plague, the girl wouldn't be like running around and playing. She'd be sick in bed. But she can't convince anyone, and it takes until Simchas Torah until they finally let them come back in the community. And it really is. It shows how the times we live in can change the way we see things, because we can read it before, we can understand it before, but we really, unfortunately, have a new understanding now.
Yeah, and then she goes, there's a whole long passage. She gives thanks. It's actually also very interesting to see. There's a lot of Musar. She's always giving thanks to Hashem. She's saying thank you for everything. You show so much kindness, and she just goes on, which is a very interesting. Is that something that you were talking before about the Venezuela Rabbim? Is that also that? Because sometimes she's like very excessive with it. It almost seems like she really is giving praise. It's not just like a formulated response.
Right. No, so there are places where she definitely is. There's a big debate also, like how pious really is. And I mean, Natalie Zeman Davis, who's a historian who happens to be Jewish, but a historian of social and cultural history of France of this period, and doesn't read the Jewish languages, but has written about Glikl and other religious women, Protestant and Catholic religious women. She calls her chapter Arguing with God, her chapter about Glikl. She thinks that she's really contending with this and having spiritual crisis. Other people say it's formulaic. Other people say she's very, very pious. You can't be in somebody's head, right? I mean, there's no way we can read. We can't even see her. It'd be one thing if we could hear her and hear her tone of voice and see her face, but we can't read what's on the page and know her true relationship with the Holy One or with anything else. But she, our framework that we can try to think about is, what is the book for? So we go back and get like, what's the genre of the book? And the book is clearly for the children. It starts out sort of self-therapeutic, and there's an element of self-therapy, but it's also a bequest, I think, for her children. And so I think it helps to frame that and those passages. It's one possibility, right? It's one hypothesis. Again, we can't get in her head. Is how she wants to help her children frame events, right? For her older children, Tzipora, the daughter in that story, when she writes the book, or when Chaim dies, the daughter in the story is now married. She's like 16 or 18, 20, I don't know, with a couple of kids. She's the oldest child. And she wants, and then the youngest children, again, when Chaim dies and Glikl begins to write, the youngest children are toddlers. And I think that she wants them to have their family's heritage, and she wants to frame for them, give them a mental framework, a spiritual framework for events. And so I think it is a true reaction. I mean, I don't think she's making it up, right? I think it is a true reflection, her older self reflecting on what her younger self felt in that moment. But it is also in the framework, the Musar that comes in the stories, of sort of creating that for her children. And my students sometimes, I mean, one way to think about it is you're listening to your grandmother, you're on the porch, she's telling you about the family stories. And sometimes, something like clicks in her mind, and she tells you another story, like, you don't expect it. If you sit on the porch with your grandmother, you don't expect to get like A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You expect to get stories mixed in with other things.
Because it really goes from that story, and then she gives thanks, and then right away, we talked about the folklore and the legend. We can talk more about them later, but we're here already just to mention it. And then she says, here's a nice story showing what happened to an empress who accepted all her afflictions with forbearance and the outcome. Emperor Charlemagne was a powerful emperor, as written in all the books in Taich. And then she goes talking about Empress Irene and Charlemagne, and it's like, what is going on here? And then she gives the whole story, And then she says, okay. She goes back to the story. She returns. She goes back. She finishes off her story with her daughter. And then she starts talking about Green Moshe coming in. A lot of people have names. And Green Moshe comes and he starts doing, he shows up and they're doing business dealings. And then she ends up back in Hamburg. And I don't think we talked a little bit. We should mention here her husband. So there's a lot of business dealings going on. And she's definitely involved in the business dealings and the business end of things from the beginning. She gives advice to her husband all the time. She's involved. They do it together. He's the businessman running around in the beginning until her husband passes, but she's involved. And just there's a lot of, I guess the two things that come up a lot from that point on, really throughout the book, is business dealings and then shidduchim and marriages and dowries. There's a lot of that. So there's a lot of dealings and being double crossed, and there's a lot of there's lawsuits that arise. And so we can talk a little bit about the business. And so the husband, Chaim, really deals in diamonds and jewelry and in commodities. He's doing a lot. He goes to fairs. He's doing a lot. He's a real go-getter. He's really doing a lot of things.
Yeah, he is. It's interesting because it is those two things. It's and they're mixed up, right? For us, those are separate, the family affairs and the business affairs. But for her, it's really of a package in a way, and not just for her, but for Jews, again, of the socioeconomic class in this time, because the shidduchim are part of building the business, and you want to make sure that you have a firm financial basis, right, for this to go on. It's interesting, the ones when in places she tells a business deal's gone bad. And again, if we frame it as like her children, is it just a grudge? Or is she warning them what can happen? Is she warning them against specific people? Sometimes it brings to mind for me the scene at the end of in Nevi'im, at the end of the life of David HaMelech, where I always get so disappointed in that Haftorah because here's this grand thing and he's on his deathbed and like the last thing he says is like, and never trust this person, right? And then get revenge for that. Like I wanted to end on some like higher spiritual level. And this kind of reminds me of that sometimes because she's like keeping these families, like she's on the one saying everything's in the hands of the Kadosh Baruch Hu and everything's for the best. And we're just going to wait for redemption, and we're going to be glad for good things that happen, and we're going to be forbearance, have forbearance when bad things happen. On the other hand, she's holding these grudges. So maybe that's where Natalie Zeman Davis gets the arguing with God part. It's human, right? She's a human being. And they do build the business together. And she talks in places about when we first came to Hamburg, the people didn't even wear jewelry. They just wore gold. They weren't wearing gems. It wasn't in fashion. And so we traded in gold. And then we sort of began trading in pearls, and we did more things. And you can't carry, right? So on the one hand, everything's in the capital is in this very real physical form of gems and precious metals and different things they're trading in. On the other hand, you don't want to carry that on long journeys. So they do have these letters of credit. There's an elaborate system under here that I don't fully understand of letters of credit. It's an early credit system. It's a mercantile system. This is where in history, if people who learn Western civilization or Western European history, this is where you learn about the beginning of mercantilism and the extension of credit across long distances due to the relative security, despite the incidents that happen, the relative security of travel. Again, we also have relative security of travel, and we, God forbid, we know lots of people who die in car accident, right? So I used to read these things and think, oh, it was so dangerous then, and now we're safe. Like, well, not so much, right? We live in a basically safe environment, and things happen. And she too lived in basically a safe environment, and things happened. And so they're involved in building these little trade in precious metals and gemstones into really an international network. And very early on, this is really a key part of it. They have servants, right? And the servants also kind of demonstrate how the domestic and the business dealings are mixed up with each other. Because the servants, so she mentions one early on named Avram Cantor. She says he's their first servant. And what's his first duty? And this is interesting gender-wise too, to take care of the children. It's not just women they hire to take care of children. They hire this young man. He takes care of the children. And as they start to trust him, they give him money and he becomes their business, like their junior business partner or employee. They send him off to trade with a little bit of money and some letters. And he comes back. And eventually they seem to have a series of these young men mostly who work in the household, who then are sent off with a little bit of capital and then a little bit more and a little bit more. And then they're ready to marry themselves get married, right? And so they get a little piece. Chaim gives them a little piece and they go off and make their own household and their own business. And sometimes that works well and sometimes it doesn't work well. And sometimes it ends very badly. And so she tells a lot of those stories. And there's places where on every page, one particular deal that ends up badly, and she says they end up on friendly terms anyway, is Jutta Berliner, who becomes an important court Jew. The court Jews is a whole other piece of this. She's on the edges of this court Jew society, right? These Jews who supplied financial and military and other things for princes and other people, and so she has a couple pages about this one particular deal and how it was built up and how it ended up in a legal battle and how they ended up friends anyway, despite this bitter battle. And on every page, she taught every piece of the decision. I couldn't decide yet. Chaim had to talk to me first. He had to talk to me first. He had to talk to me first before I did it. And then I drew up the contract, and it had points. It goes through the 7 points the contract had. She wrote the contract. And in other places too, right? This thing, and he had to talk to me first, and he never did anything without talking to me. So it's interesting. It's true. He is the one that's going around to all the fairs, and she's the one who's staying home and doing the books and doing the part from home. And again, until he passes away, and then she takes her son or somebody with him. Seems to be difficult for a woman to travel safely on her own. I mean, partly he's the man. She has a child every 2 years, right? She's constantly nursing a child. And she seems, unlike other women of her socioeconomic class, to have nursed her own children. Many wealthier women like her would have hired wet nurses. It's very tempting, right? From a La Leche League point of view, it's very tempting for me, the granola child of the late 20th century, to say, well, she nursed her own children and most of them lived. Who knows? But that so she is doing for that part. But in terms of gender roles, and then I'll be quiet and let you ask my next question. So we tend to think of this conventional wisdom that men are in the world and women are in the home. And you see Glikl and you say, wow, that's not so easy to say. Glikl's very much in the business. But also what's different is our conception of what's home. Right? Because home, this is not the suburbs where the home is one place and then you go to work and you come back. The home is the center of the business, right? So when Glikl, if we think about the traditional role of the woman being in charge of the home, then she is, but the home is also the economic livelihood of the family, right? So the divisions, the categories are very different than ours. And actually, one little digression, if you look in Eshes Chayil, it's also the woman, right, is in charge of a lot of the economic means. It doesn't mean that she wasn't at home, right? It's a different concept of what's in the domestic sphere and what's in the public sphere. And that's a much longer discussion. I just wanted to mention it. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, I don't know. I can't even forgot your question. I'm sorry. You get Professor going and I just don't stop.
No, it's very interesting. I mean, that's what Glikl is. The book is so fascinating. There's so much. We can do, a whole series on Glikl alone. There's so much to talk about. We're just pulling things out. Really, I think everyone should read it. And, you can take out, I'm sure everyone will take out different things from it as well. Just like flipping through, we get to Yaakov and the drunk Yaakov, and there's so many, and I'm reading in the English, not in the Yiddish or the Hebrew, but you can still get, and she talks about Yaakov, and he's drunk, and he goes at the mail clerk, and they're in a place with the best beer, and then she said, as we wrote on, I kept looking back for my Yaakov, but no Yaakov. Like the way she writes, you can see, and it's but no Yaakov. She's coming from the end, she just keeps going, and she talks about it, and they're middle of the night, they're soaking, they end up going on, they show up at the inn, middle of the night, the milk clerk comes in, he's screaming, he's brandishing a dagger, I'm going to kill you. And these scenes are very, it's Glikl's writing, and then with the terrific English translation now, they really, you really see them. You can envision the scenes right in front of you, and you're reading this, and you can see exactly what's going on. And she talks about the fairs, Leipzig Fair, her husband, and how it's dangerous to get sick there, people get sick there. There's just so much here. I also want to mention, if listeners are curious, we're talking about Glikl, do we only know about it from the book? No, there's the facsimile, actually, even in the English translation of the community ledger, and you have her handwriting on the bottom. We know of her from other sources as well. She existed besides for just this volume. Just you talked about Reb Yudah, as she called him, Berliner, and how he worked for them, and then he became extremely rich, a court Jew. He talked about Cantor, the servant. He ends up in Copenhagen. There's in Denmark. There's just a lot here who she talks about, and she sometimes quotes. She quotes other things also. She starts talking about. She quotes Rabbi Yochanan and the Mishnayos. She talks she brings down. I don't know where she knew. She quotes Chazal also. She's bringing different stuff out, and then she starts talking about various different stories of. She goes to the family again. There's just so much in here that she talks about, and then we really get onto the family. I don't know what else we can kind of. Jump about a bit, but I think there's also there's a long story where they're going around and they end up in one town or another, and they're traveling around. They have to come back. There's wars going on. They're trying to get home. They hire things. It's Yom Kippur. They end up traveling on like they get up there right before Yom Kippur. They get up to some random place. Then there's the really interesting quote that the only time she kind of talks about herself with her friend, and she says, Rameir, who was I with? As I mentioned, told my husband, Reb Chaim, why are you so worried? And why are you making your wife dress so hideously? So my husband answered, God knows I'm not worried about myself and the money I'm carrying. It's the woman folk I'm worried about, my wife and my maid servant. He said, Rameir, no need to worry seriously, Reb Chaim. You are wrong about your wife. You should not have made her dress so hideously. Nobody would have harmed her anyway. My husband of blessed memory was very angry at Rameir's joking and took it very much to heart. And I think in the introduction, though, this is like the only time she kind of like alludes to herself. That's something that we don't really see. It's kind of absent in the book, besides for this kind of one little comment that she makes in reference that someone said about her.
Yeah, we do come to, again, that word autobiography with expectations of the self, which is not so much here. People are part of networks. I mean, it's true now, and it's even more true. She positions herself with her husband, and then her family, right? Her children and her parents and their cousins, and she seems to know relationships very well. She refers to this was my second cousin, this was my third cousin, right? She seems to know very, very well exactly all the relationships. So she does not talk in that. There's one other place where she gives something of herself, and it's quite moving. It may have said that in the introduction, and I just wanted, because you talked about knowing and the scene being very live, so I just want to talk for a moment about Glikl's language. She writes in what's referred to in different. It's not quite technically Alt Yiddish, but we call it Alt Yiddish, Older Yiddish. It's before about 1800 Yiddish, and she's from Western Europe, right? Also, she's from Germany. So before about 1800, whether you were Glikl in Germany or whether you were somebody in Poland, when a book was published, it contained very little of the Slavic influence, right? So the modern Yiddish that we know is Old German in Hebrew letters with some Romance elements, and then with the Slavic part that gets added in Eastern Europe, both the syntax and the vocabulary doesn't exist for Glikl. So if you're a Yiddish reader, it's 100% worth getting the book in the original Hebrew translation with the original Yiddish and with the Hebrew and the more extensive notes beside it. But the English that Sarah Friedman has done just brings it to life, because nobody in the world today speaks the language that Glikl spoke, right? Even native Yiddish speakers speak a different language. And before World War II, when there were secular native Yiddish speakers, they spoke a different language. It's even translated in the early 20th century into modern Yiddish. So it's a different language. The view of the self, there's one other place where Glikl's real pain comes through. And when I teach this book, I teach book 5 and the death scene of Glikl of Chaim a lot, because I think that there's a lot to learn from it in various ways, including about their relationship and about whether other women were also businesswomen. But I'm 200, and her husband Chaim has fallen, and they've called in different doctors. And now we see the Sephardi and the Portuguese again at midnight. Avram Lopez sent for the hernia surgeon, as the injury seemed to him ripe for surgery. As soon as the surgeon went in, they realized what was the matter. The surgeon left, saying that unfortunately there was no possible remedy. Then I said to my husband, dearest, may I touch you? For I was forbidden to him at that time, right? She's Anita, and she says, may I touch you? And he replied, God forbid, my child. You'll soon be going to the mikveh. But alas, he did not live to see that day. So I remained standing by his side a while longer. So she doesn't say, I was in distress, right? But the scene, she doesn't have to, right? Show rather than tell. The scene is so, I think there we also see like a little crack into Glikl's own soul and the pain that she's going through in that moment. So yes, they are few and far between, and mostly the picture of the Glikl self with capital S that we get is from reading the whole book and sort of thinking about it and looking at where she's at and looking at the religious language and trying to see, is she arguing with God? Is she accepting God? And sort of thinking about those questions ourselves. And we get one self from that. But in addition to the moment that you mentioned, Nafi, there is this other moment that's just so, I was shocked the first time. I don't know, first time I read it, but when I read it again as a student, because she's so careful about Sniut, right? And to mention that she's Anita seems such a break from the expectations. I'm being a little ahistorical, but I don't think it's unjustified, because it's not really fair to look at the way Tarat Mishpacha is taught today and learned back to an earlier time, right? Isn't early? And this is like the first thing that's taught is, right, then don't talk to anybody, especially among Ashkenazim. And this is an area where Ashkenazim and Sephardim are very different, right? Sephardic women, before their wedding, go to the mikveh with a whole host of other women singing and joyful. For Ashkenazim, it's a very private. And so to learn that back a few hundred years and say Glikl is the same way, but it just seems to me inconceivable that this wasn't for her. There's no other place where she would say anything so private and personal about her status or her relationship with her husband. And so that she's does that here, and for her children seems to me to just speak. It's heartbreaking and wrenching when you first read it, and then when you think about what it is for her to break that taboo and to mention this and what she means to be read. I'm 100% certain she means this book to be read. Then that's really all the more that she is really sort of trying to cry out in a way that she wants to be recognized.
Yeah, and that's a really poignant scene when the husband is dying. He fell and he had an accident, and then they tried to get in the doctor and different things, and then as you said there, the interesting thing though, and I noticed this reading the book, and a friend of mine told me he just read Glikl, and the part that he was struck by is that the husband tells her that she's in Nida, so nothing doing, but then the husband seems to hug Glikl's mother. Right? I'm trying to look for that now. I'm trying to find it. There's some comment there which is funny. And they said, on the morning of the Sabbath after the meal, my mother, may she live long, came to see him and embraced and kissed him tearfully, saying, "My son, do you want to leave us like this? Don't you have any instructions to me?" He replied, "My dear mother-in-law, you know I've loved you like my own mother. I have no instructions to give you, only that you console my Glichlin." He has that kind of
right
phrase. These are the last words that the party said to my mother. So that part is in there. So the mother-in-law, it's kind of like an interesting contrast.
Right. So that is exactly the point about being ahistorical that I was trying to be careful about. I think that for us to read back from modern Haredi society where men don't touch any woman who's not their wife into the 17th century. I mean, think about right, North African French rebbeim in the 20th century. They don't have this, right? They have a very different concept of what is permitted and not permitted in terms of touching women. And I think you'll find many French rebbeim who will double kiss on the cheek of somebody, right? Then where the only prohibition is your own wife in Nida, but anybody else, the idea, and it's not a stranger, right? It's not like I don't know whether Chaim would have shaken the hand of a woman who's either not related to him or not Jewish, like keeping a tavern in some place where he has to stay on a trip. I have no idea. But we see from this scene that he's lived with her as his surrogate mother since he was 16 years old, 15, 16 years old, and he's 40, right? So in his mind, it is a family member. But I would say that historically, we can learn from this that the idea that the only woman a man can touch is his wife or his close family, this just shows it's just not true. I mean, that would be my take. It's just a historical place. Yeah.
Obviously, there's something historically interesting. And when my friend asked this, I said clearly, because Nida is in Shulchan Aruch and it's Archakas Nida, and he's like, I'm not touching you. He can't touch his wife who's in Nida. That's clear halacha, finished, right. The end, and you see that. But then the mother-in-law, is some sort of. There's
no prohibition. From my understanding, Shulchan Aruch, I don't want to start saying things that I didn't like. I was taught by certain people, but so my understanding is that if you read the halacha, the clear prohibition is on touching his wife who's in Nida, and everything else is sort of like built up around it. And he clearly has a very different understanding than many modern yeshivish communities.
Right, so there's a different kind of look. So that again, but that the point of this whole, what I'm trying to bring out from this story also is that you see like that historical view. It allows you to look at it in a lens on society that's different than maybe ours, or different than how we perceive things. A lot of times today we look at, we're like, well, they probably did this just like we do, and sometimes you see it's different. And there's throughout the book, there's other things also. Again, so there's that unfortunate scene, and then he passes away. I mean, and again, by the way, we passed over tons of stuff with the family and raising the kids, and there's stories with the business, and there's a story where there's a whole murder scene that they have to find. Someone comes and they're fighting the dead body. There's someone else, and there's things all over the place. So after that, like you mentioned earlier, most of her kids are still single, and she really then the rest of until her remarriage, she then spends a lot of time making shidduchim, marrying off her kids, trying to get proper shidduchim, she's working still, coming up with the dowry money, and getting these good, proper shidduchim for the kids. And that really is a lot of the rest of the book. And before she talks about her remarriage to Hertz Levy, and then she kind of ends her life, she moves out of Hamburg. So if we want to just, again, we're going a little long, we can go on forever about this, and I can always do more episodes on Glikl if listeners are interested. There's so much to say here, but just, try to just in brief, talk about some of that other stuff.
Yeah, I think it is good to wrap it up. We don't want to keep people too long. There's plenty left to read. We could talk for many hours and there'd still be more left to read. But Yeah, the climax really is book 5, right? So there's these 7 books. The first is this short little, is much shorter, and it really is Musser. And there's places where I compare that to another woman, Bela Perlhefter, who lives in about the same time. And then 2, 3, and 4, where she and Chaim establish themselves, and then they have more children, and each one sort of has a focus, but it really is this general trajectory of building the family and then gradually marrying the children. And then book 5 is this climax with the deathbed scene, which is quite dramatic. And as you said, like the scenes that jump off the page, then that is the key. That is the one that really is blow by blow and jumps off the page. I have this little fantasy of having a movie about Glikl, and in my head, Meryl Streep is Glikl, and she's right, the older woman, the wise woman. And then the second is, for a long time she doesn't get married. There's a lot of risk, and there's an earlier place I noticed today also where she talks about her mother-in-law never having remarried, and that she didn't. At first, she says she didn't remarry because she was young, and that seems funny to us. Like, we think if you're young, you are going to remarry, but as soon as one remarries, she loses control of her own finances. Right, so she wants to have her own take control of her own affairs, and she wants to make sure her children are married because before she even thinks about another marriage. And she really does look at it from a financial point of view, from a comfort point of view. She is obsessed. She's so interesting because she talks about the beginning of the book. She talks about how her father took care of everyone, including her grandmother, his mother-in-law, and other people, and how good that is. And at the same time, she is, if I would say, obsessive with anything besides marrying her children, is that she shouldn't be a burden on her children. Right? She wants to have enough left for herself so that she can support herself in her old age and not rely on her children. She doesn't want any of her children to have to take care of her. And she sort of thinks she has it arranged. She waits 10 years and she thinks she's got everything set. And she's married 1, or I guess 2. I'm getting confused now, daughters in Metz. And she accepts a shidduch for herself, right? She sort of makes her own shidduch with this person in Metz. And book 6 is really, it's interesting because 10 years, why 10 years? She says she won't. Does she say she won't ever as her own finances? I also wonder personally, and maybe this is a little not modest enough of me. I recently began to wonder if she also wants to wait so that she can't have more children, right? She doesn't want to get married and she's got enough, right? She doesn't want to get married again and have any more children that she'll have to take care of, or for her own body, right? Or all these different things. So 10 years later, she gets married, and she talks in book 6 really about the culture shock of going to Metz, of her new husband's children and their very different lifestyle, of how different she is from their own mother. And it's really sort of themes, not the details, but the themes can really resonate with us in blended families today, and the challenges that these things present. They're mostly adult children, but there's still these sort of culture shock and living with her the furniture and the jewels of her husband's wife who has passed. And then book 7, he and his sons have some unfortunate financial happenings and make some bad decisions, combination of those things. And it really is sort of this resolution. And it doesn't really end, right? There is a story that people quote quite a bit in those last 2 books about the collapse of the women's section in the synagogue in Metz, where rumor, right? Somebody comes in and says something has happened, and everybody stampedes out. And in the stampede out, and all the women on the stairs, a couple of people are killed as that happens, and that is an important source for that tragic event. And then it sort of peters out, and we get a story at the end that doesn't seem to have much. It doesn't seem that she had the opportunity, or in the end, it doesn't seem that Glikl was able to, for whatever reason, from choice or not, she didn't really write a conclusion. It just sort of peters out. But we do know about her. We know about her from the Haskarot Neshamot that are in Metz, and from gravestones of family members. And Natalie Zim Davis went and found some other records, and we know about her descendants in England and in other places. I met someone in our shul is a descendant in some way. So we do know about her in that way. But it is it's not only a historical record, and it's quite a artistic. There are places where she forgets and says she went back and so forth, but remember, she doesn't have a word processor, right? She's not using a computer. Everything that she writes by hand. But she has, in the end, a plan and a construction and a climax and a couple parts. And so in addition to being the historical record and a view of this woman's life and her family's life, it is also a beautiful work of prose.
Yeah, and so, again, there's a lot more we can talk about, and if anyone's interested in hearing more about Glikl, we can try to do another episode. Can email me and let me know. So let's talk a little bit about the translation. Hopefully, perhaps there'll be another episode where we can do with the translator Sarah Friedman. So this was done. Chava Turniansky, as you said, worked on it for many years and published the Hebrew edition with Zalman Shazar, I believe. And I'll put a link to that in the show's notes. I don't know how easily it is to order to America, but I'll put it there. Now, that one has more extensive notes, footnotes, and explanation, things like that. Then it was done into English. Sarah Friedman translated it into English, and there's, I think, it's still presented by Chava Turniansky, so there's still an introduction. It's shorter than the Hebrew, but there's an introduction. There's still notes, explanatory notes. There are some appendices with family trees and things like that, and there's an index, of course, and things like that. Now, just a little bit, just briefly to talk about the Yiddish and the translation, and also, I think more importantly here for our purposes is because people will say they've read Glikl or not. If you haven't read Glikl, again, I'll link to the English as well. You should purchase it and read it. But why people say, "Oh, I've read Glikl. I read in that old translation. Why should I read this new translation?" And I think that's an important point that we should highlight. The new one published by Sarah Friedman and Chava Turniansky with Brandeis University Press, I think, is important for listeners to own that and read that one as opposed to the old one.
Yes, absolutely. And here's why. So there's two older English translations. There's the Lowenthal translation that if you had a college Jewish history course that was probably assigned, it's the first one that I read. It's based on an early German translation. Here's the issue with that one. In the effort to make an autobiography, and I forgot the name of the German editor now, and then Marvin Lowenthal, who based his English translation on that, cut out and rearranged in order to make a direct narrative arc. So they had the idea of autobiography in their head. They wrote, and things that didn't fit that, like the whole first book of Musar, is mostly cut out of that translation. And you get a page of it, and then it goes straight into book 2 as if it were book 1, where it starts talking about Glikl's family tree and gives us a nice narrative arc. Now, that's the way we like to read. It's comfortable for us as modern readers of autobiography, but it's not true to Glikl's own voice. Glikl herself, again, like sitting with your grandmother, right? She's telling stories, she's bringing different things in. You are free as a reader to say, I can't go through this 6 pages of the story about being captured on a ship in a wild island and having a child with a savage beast and then getting torn. Like, there's all these things. But if you cut that out and rearrange in a nice linear thing, it's as if they were trying to do Glikl a favor by doing that. But instead, we lose her because we don't hear her own voice. There is one other English translation by Beth Sion. It's in English as Beth Diane, right? Abrahams, which is much truer to. There's one place where there's something cuts out, but it basically is much truer to the full text of Glikl. But it's a sort of Victorian English that's a little harder to read. It's not beautiful like this, and even that changes language. And there's one place, and I had the page numbers now, and now I can't read my own notes, but there's a place in book 2, just for instance of the sensibilities of the time in which that translation was done. There's a place where Glikl says, "Mein lieber man," like my dear husband, and Abraham changes it to "your father." Like, even in term of endearment of "my dear husband" is like too much for her, right? She can't handle that. That's too immodest. And she changes it to "your father." So there's places where it changes. This is a clear, beautiful English that's as true as one could be to Glikl's own words and puts the whole narrative arc back in its place. Again, Chava Turniansky did the scholarship. She made an extensive apparatus of notes about both Yiddish language of the time and historical notes, a very long introduction. It's published in this huge several hundred pages of the original Yiddish and Hebrew translation in Hebrew. And then the rights were sold to Brandeis University Press for an English translation. It took Sylvia Fuchs-Fried there like 10 years to find a translator who could do it justice. So it sat for a long time. They can't publish in English, just the realities of publishing in English. They can't publish the huge several hundred pages with all the notes and everything. So it's compact in that way, but you can use them together, and it has the basic notes, and it has the basic introduction and translation, and it's available, and it's in paperback, and it's an ebook. And it came out, unfortunately, just in December 2019, right before the pandemic. So it didn't get quite the big splash that it could have, but it's absolutely, if you read it before in college or in some other context, it's worth reading the new Sarah Friedman translation based on the Chava Turniansky work.
And it's a 350-page book, and it's in paperback, and it's $19.85 now on Amazon. So it's pretty. It's that's cheap for an academic book, and an amazing way that it's cheap. So it's really affordable. It's again highly recommended. And I'll draw a parallel when I did the Magal Tov of the Chida, also an autobiography by his travelogue, and when I did the podcast episode on that, so we kind of also discussed the book and the structure of the book and pulled different things out. And of course, we didn't do it justice because it's not possible to do justice in a podcast, an hour and a half, or however long it is here. So the same thing with Glikl. I hope to get back to Chida, just by the way, for those listening, but same thing with Glikl. There's much more. We can go through it systematically, working through much more, pulling out all the stories. If listeners are interested, email me. But this, again, I view this episode as, if you weren't familiar with Glikl, now you'll be familiar. You've heard some stuff. There's many stories we left out. And hopefully, if you did know of Glikl, now you heard about the new translation and you heard, some stories, and we highlighted some things. So thank you, Dr. Greenblatt, for joining me. I will, again, link to the English one in the show's notes, which is readily available on Amazon, on Prime, or Brandeis website, wherever. And I'll also link to the Hebrew, which is more extensive. There is a purpose of owning both Cherniansky editions. So I will do that in the show's notes.
Thank you so much. Thank you for letting us bring Glikl and Chava Cherniansky to the world.